My daughter, Angie, shouted it. Right there across the dinner table, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her face tight with a fury that felt both childish and deeply ugly. Her husband, Marcus, my esteemed son-in-law, sat beside her, not looking shocked or embarrassed, but smug, victorious. He'd finally gotten what he wanted. I didn't argue. 40 years working trauma in the ER teaches you the futility of arguing with unreasonable, demanding people. You assess, you act, you control the bleeding. I didn't cry. Tears felt like a waste of precious resources in that moment. No. I just looked from Angie's furious face to Marcus's self-satisfied smirk. I calmly folded the cheap paper napkin beside my plate. They didn't use the good linens when it was just family, placed it deliberately on the table, stood up and went to pack my suitcase. An hour later, as I rolled my bag across their ridiculously expensive imported tile foyer, a car service, my car service, honked discreetly at their overwrought front gate. I opened the door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and didn't look back. I was on my way to the beautiful house by the sea I'd secretly bought weeks ago, the one they knew nothing about. They thought they were kicking out a burdensome, dependent old woman, finally freeing up that prime piece of real estate, my bedroom, for Marcus's precious home gym. They had absolutely no idea they were actually evicting their landlady. Oh yes, let me tell you how my quiet retirement dream, funded by a lifetime of hard work they never acknowledged, became their spectacular eviction nightmare. Because first, you need to understand who they thought I was, and who I really am. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. To Angie and especially to Marcus, I was always just Patty Williams. Mom, retired nurse, widow. A nice enough woman, probably, but essentially, background noise. A relic from a simpler, less glamorous past. They saw the 40 years I'd spent at County General, not as a demanding career requiring immense skill, resilience, and the ability to manage life and death chaos under extreme pressure, but as, well, just nursing. Something vaguely domestic, vaguely subservient. Certainly not something that paid well or required any real financial acumen. They saw the modest, paid-off brick ranch house where I'd raised Angie, the house my late husband Frank and I had bought when the neighborhood was still just starting out. They saw the sensible, reliable car I drove for 15 years. They saw the simple, comfortable clothes I preferred. The home-cooked meals I made because I enjoyed cooking, not because I couldn't afford takeout. They saw a life lived carefully, frugally. They assumed it was a life lived out of necessity. What they didn't see, what they never bothered to ask about, was the reality behind the facade. They didn't know that head nurse in a level 1 trauma center meant managing multi-million-dollar budgets, overseeing a staff of over 100 nurses and technicians, negotiating with powerful hospital administrators, and making split-second decisions that impacted not just lives, but the very financial health of the department. They didn't know that Frank and I, children of parents who remembered the breadlines of the Depression, were savers. Obsessive, meticulous savers. We lived on Frank's salary as a city engineer and quietly, diligently invested almost every penny of mine. I wasn't flashy about it. I learned early on, watching doctors lose fortunes on risky ventures, that slow, steady and quiet was the way to build real wealth. I read investment books during my rare off hours. I took advice from grateful patients. A quiet cardiologist who suggested a particular mutual fund, a retired banker who explained the beauty of dividend reinvestment. Over 40 years, that quiet, steady accumulation grew. When Frank passed suddenly 5 years ago, his city pension was solid, but the life insurance payout, combined with my own substantial, meticulously managed portfolio, tipped me over a line I'd never even aimed for. I wasn't just comfortable, I was wealthy. Not Marcus and Angie flashy, leveraged to the hilt wealthy, but solid, debt-free, FU money wealthy. The kind of wealth that buys silence, peace and freedom. I never told Angie. Why would I? Frank and I had raised her to value education, hard work, kindness. We wanted her to build her own life, find her own way. Flaunting my nest egg felt wrong, crass, like it would undermine the very values we tried to instill. Besides, she seemed to be doing just fine on her own, building her event planning business, marrying Marcus who seemed successful if a bit too slick for my taste. They bought a huge house in a gated community, far bigger than they needed, in my opinion, but it was their choice. Then came my retirement. The endless quiet of my empty house started to feel less peaceful. more lonely. Angie and Marcus seized on this. "Mom, it's silly for you to rattle around in that big old house alone," Angie had insisted, her voice full of daughterly concern that even then felt slightly off-key. "And this neighborhood, honestly, it's getting a little rough." Translation: it wasn't rough, it was gentrifying, and my property value was skyrocketing. A fact Angie the event planner somehow failed to mention, unlike her husband, the salesman. Their solution? "I should sell my house. It's a seller's market, Patty." Marcus had boomed, already seeing dollar signs, and move in with them. "Just temporarily, Mom," Angie chirped. "While you figure out your next step, maybe look for a nice condo somewhere warmer." Here's the kicker, the part they conveniently forgot later. They were struggling with the down payment for their McMansion. My house sold for a shocking amount, far more than I needed. So I did something generous. Foolish perhaps. In retrospect, I bought their house, not co-signed, not gifted them the down payment. I bought the whole damn thing, outright, putting it in a blind trust I controlled, the P. Williams Family Trust. I drew up a simple informal agreement. They would live there, cover the property taxes and utilities, significantly less than market rent, and maintain the place. It was my investment. It was their home, subsidized by my generosity, a detail they seemed to conveniently forget the moment the ink was dry. To them it became their house, and I, when I finally moved in after much insistence on their part, became the inconvenient long-term guest, the unseen landlady. My arrival at their house several months after the closing was heralded with the kind of performative enthusiasm usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or wealthy relatives expected to leave a large inheritance. Angie cleared out what was clearly meant to be Marcus's home office, the largest of the 4 upstairs bedrooms, boasting the best view of the manicured lawn and its own attached bathroom, and declared it Mom's suite as if bestowing a great honor. Marcus, ever the charmer when an audience was present, made a grand show of carrying my 2 modest suitcases upstairs, grunting slightly for dramatic effect. "Welcome home, Patty," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder with enough force to make me stumble. "Make yourself comfortable. Mi casa es su casa." His Spanish was atrocious, but his sentiment, I suspected, was even worse. For the first few weeks the illusion of a harmonious multi-generational household held thin as tissue paper but present nonetheless. Angie was perpetually slammed with her event planning business, which seemed to involve more lunches with potential clients than actual events. Returning home late, exhausted and demanding quiet, Marcus was often out, even later, presumably schmoozing customers at the luxury car dealership or attending networking events designed to project an image of success far exceeding his actual commission statements. The house, a sprawling monument to questionable taste and excessive square footage, was large enough that we could mostly avoid direct collisions, existing in separate orbits around a cold, empty center. I, acutely aware of my precarious position as the temporary guest, tried to be the perfect invisible housemate. I kept my room, Mom's suite, immaculate, a small island of quiet order in their sea of casual, expensive clutter. I was quiet as a church mouse, tiptoeing down the hallway, keeping my television volume low, mindful of Marcus's frequent complaints about noise. I offered to cook simple, healthy meals, clean the perpetually messy kitchen, run errands, walk the ridiculously named French bulldog, couture, anything to contribute, to ease their perceived burden, to earn my keep in this temporary arrangement. I even started contributing a significant monthly sum towards groceries and utilities, transferring the money electronically directly into their joint account. I didn't want to owe them anything. I wanted to maintain my independence, even while living under my roof. They accepted the money naturally, without a flicker of protest or even acknowledgement. It simply vanished into the black hole of their aspirational spending, my quiet contribution drowned out by the constant, noisy demands of their lifestyle. But gradually, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dynamic began to shift. My status as the welcome grieving mother started to morph into tolerated long-term guest with uncertain end date. My contributions, both financial and domestic, became not just expected but seemingly invisible, taken entirely for granted. My very presence, once solicited with such performative concern, began to feel inconvenient, an awkward footnote in the glamorous story they were trying to write for themselves. Angie, my own daughter, started leaving little notes on the gleaming stainless steel refrigerator, passive-aggressive directives replacing polite requests. "Mom, dishwasher needs emptying. Varix, we're out of organic kale for my morning smoothie, please add to list. Kids need rides to soccer and ballet tomorrow. Can you handle?" My quiet offers to help were twisted into assigned tasks. My time suddenly assumed to be theirs to manage. Marcus, who had initially maintained a facade of bluff, salesman's charm, began to treat me with a kind of benign neglect that steadily curdled into visible palpable annoyance. He'd grunt a barely audible hello in the morning on his way to the Nespresso machine, his eyes already glued to his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. He'd sigh loudly and dramatically if my reading lamp was still on in the living room when he came home late, muttering about electricity costs. He stopped including me in even the most basic family conversations, addressing comments about weekend plans or household matters only to Angie as if I were simply part of the furniture, incapable of hearing or understanding. I started to feel like exactly that. A piece of furniture they were constantly having to navigate around. An old, slightly worn, inherited armchair that didn't quite match their aggressively modern aesthetic. Comfortable enough in its own way, perhaps useful in a pinch, but ultimately undeniably in the way of their grand design. They seemed to have completely conveniently forgotten, or perhaps deliberately suppressed the fundamental fact of my ownership, the silent power vested in the P. Williams family trust, in the narrative they were constructing in their own minds, and likely projecting to their social circle. This was their house. Their achievement, their domain, their stage set for their relentless performance of upper-middle-class success. And I, the quiet woman living upstairs in the best guest room, paying a substantial portion of their bills, keeping to myself, was becoming a glitch in their perfect program, a discordant note in their carefully orchestrated symphony. They didn't see me as their benefactor, their quiet, unseen landlady. They saw me as an aging dependent, a financial drain, a social inconvenience who was seriously overstaying her ill-defined welcome. The resentment was building, layer by quiet, passive-aggressive layer. And Marcus, I soon realized with a chilling clarity, had his ambitious, covetous eyes firmly fixed on my room. Marcus Carter operated on a simple, straightforward philosophy. He deserved the best. The best car leased naturally, the best clothes often bought on sale but presented as bespoke, the best house mortgaged to the hilt, unbeknownst to him owned by his mother-in-law. And apparently the best room within that house. His ambition wasn't tempered by humility or gratitude. It was fueled by a deep-seated insecurity that manifested as a constant restless craving for more, for better, for bigger. My room, the spacious Malm suite, overlooking the meticulously and expensively landscaped backyard, became the focus of this craving. It wasn't just a bedroom to him, it was prime, underutilized real estate within his domestic kingdom. It was potential for his needs, his desires, his ever-expanding ego. The campaign started subtly, as these territorial disputes often do within families. He'd linger in the hallway outside my closed door, ostensibly talking to Angie, but his voice pitched just loud enough for me, sitting inside reading, to hear every carefully chosen word. "You know, babe," he'd muse, his voice full of casual consideration, "that room gets the absolute best morning light. It would be perfect for a workout space. I could finally set up that Peloton properly, maybe even add a small weight bench, get my head right before hitting the dealership." He framed his desire as a pursuit of wellness, a necessary component of his high-performance lifestyle. Or later, perhaps after losing a potential big commission on the phone in the cramped downstairs den, he used as a makeshift office. I swear, I can't think straight in that little cubbyhole down there. No natural light, distractions everywhere. If I had a real office somewhere quiet, with a decent view, like Patty's room, I could probably double my commissions this year. Easy. Now his desire was framed as a sound business investment, crucial for the family's financial future. My room wasn't just space. It was potential income being squandered by my mere presence. He began physically encroaching on the space, testing the boundaries like a persistent vine probing for cracks in a wall. He'd borrow the comfortable armchair from the corner of my room, claiming he needed it for a crucial Zoom meeting with a VIP client, and then forget to return it for days, leaving me with only the hard desk chair. He started storing his bulky golf clubs, which he used maybe twice a year, in the back of my walk-in closet, sighing dramatically about the shocking lack of dedicated storage space elsewhere in their oversized house. Each small intrusion was a deliberate probe, a test of my willingness to yield territory. His comments, overheard or delivered with feigned casualness, became more direct, less veiled. He'd walk past my open door. I always kept it slightly ajar, a lingering habit from 40 years of needing to be aware of hospital ward activity and potential emergencies. Glance inside at me reading peacefully and shake his head with a sigh. Such a waste. he'd mutter just loud enough for me to catch the words as he walked away. Prime real estate going completely unused. Could be a killer home gym. He was relentlessly framing his selfish entitlement not just as practical or financially prudent, but as the only logical use of the space. I, the quiet occupant, the retired nurse living on her pension, was the inefficiency in his system. My simple need for a private space to sleep, read and maintain a semblance of personal dignity was presented as an obstacle to his grand vision of domestic perfection, his optimized lifestyle. He saw the room not as my temporary home, the space his wife had generously, or so he believed, offered me in my time of grief, but as his rightful territory, temporarily and inconveniently occupied by a low-value non-contributing tenant. He was the self-proclaimed king of this castle, a castle built on my financial foundation, and I was merely a serf occupying potentially valuable farmland that could be put to much more productive, i.e., his use. His resentment wasn't just about the physical space itself, though that was clearly a significant factor for a man obsessed with square footage and status symbols. It was, I suspected, more deeply rooted in me. I represented a world, a value system that he fundamentally disdained, a world of quiet dedication, modest living, earned respect and values that weren't measured in horsepower, commission checks, or the size of one's home gym. My very presence, my lack of flashy consumerism, my contentment with simple things, served as a silent, perhaps even subconscious judgment on his own relentless, exhausting pursuit of superficial validation. And he couldn't stand it. Getting rid of me, taking my room, wasn't just about acquiring more space for his toys. It was about erasing a perspective, a presence that made him feel vaguely inadequate, vaguely judged. He began working on Angie in earnest, applying the same relentless high-pressure sales tactics he likely used to push overpriced warranties on unsuspecting car buyers. I'd hear their muffled arguments filtering through the walls late at night, after they thought I was asleep. His voice smooth, persuasive, laced with manipulative complaints about his stress levels, his professional needs, their financial future. Her voice, initially defensive of me, trying to uphold the promise she had made, gradually weakening, conceding point by painful point under his sustained assault. He was selling her on the idea that his comfort, his needs, his potential for greater success, which naturally would directly benefit her luxury lifestyle, were objectively more important than her mother's basic need for dignity, privacy, and the specific room she had been promised. He was reframing his blatant entitlement as a shared goal, a necessary step towards achieving the perfect optimized lifestyle they both supposedly craved. And Angie, my daughter, blinded by the shine of that lifestyle, weakened by her own deep-seated insecurities, and perhaps weary of the constant conflict, was tragically predictably buying it hook, line, and sinker. Watching my daughter, my bright, capable Angie, slowly but surely succumb to Marcus's relentless campaign of entitled whining, was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal. It wasn't a sudden betrayal, but a slow, creeping erosion of her loyalty, her empathy, her own moral compass. Angie wasn't inherently cruel, not in the way Marcus seemed to be, his cruelty stemming from a deep well of arrogance and insecurity. Angie's cruelty was born of weakness, deeply fundamentally weak, riddled with an insecurity that seemed to have taken root in her adolescence and blossomed under the harsh, competitive sunlight of her adult life. Perhaps it stemmed from a lifetime of feeling overshadowed, first by her father Frank's quiet, solid engineering brilliance, then by my own demanding, high-profile career as a head nurse and administrator. We hadn't been flashy people, but we were respected, accomplished in our fields. Angie, despite her intelligence and creativity, she had a wonderful eye, a genuine passion for art curation before she abandoned it, always seemed to feel less substantial, less successful by the world's noisy metrics. She craved external validation like a plant craves sunlight. And she had found it, or thought she had, in Marcus. He, with his flashy confidence, his expensive toys, his access to a world of perceived glamour and importance, provided the validation she so desperately needed. He made her feel sophisticated, successful, chosen, finally part of the elite circle she had always observed from the outside. His approval became the currency she valued most, the bedrock of her fragile self-esteem, and she became terrified of losing it. Terrified of being cast back into the ordinariness she associated with her upbringing, with me. Initially, when Marcus first started his grumbling campaign for my room, Angie tried, bless her heart, to push back, albeit weakly, timidly. I overheard snippets of their early conversations filtering through the ridiculously thin walls of their McMansion. But Marcus, honey, that's Mom's room, she'd say, her voice hesitant, placating. "We invited her here, remember, after Dad. She needs her own space. We promised." "Her space?" Marcus would scoff, his voice laced with impatient disbelief. "Angie, be realistic. It's the biggest guest room in the house. She's one person rattling around in there. She could be perfectly comfortable, perfectly fine in the smaller room down the hall. It's still nice. It has a window. Be reasonable. I need a proper office. A dedicated space if I'm going to hit my targets this quarter, especially with the market the way it is. This isn't just about me. This is about our future, our financial security." He masterfully framed his desire as a practical necessity, a requirement for their shared success, while subtly painting my basic needs, privacy, comfort, the room she herself had designated, as unreasonable, selfish, an impediment to their progress. Angie would try again, her voice laced with a genuine if fleeting flicker of guilt. "But she just lost Dad. She's still grieving. I don't want to upset her right now. It feels cruel." "Upset her," Marcus would counter immediately, shifting seamlessly into the role of the wounded party, the misunderstood provider. "What about upsetting me, Angie? Don't my needs matter in this house? Am I less important to you than your mother? After everything I do for us, everything I provide?" He'd gesture around the large, expensively furnished room, the physical proof of his supposed success. It was classic manipulation, a textbook case of emotional blackmail. He preyed relentlessly on her insecurity, on her fear of inadequacy, forcing her into a position where defending me, her own mother, felt like an act of disloyalty, of ingratitude, towards him, her husband, the supposed architect of her wonderful life. And tragically, inevitably, it worked. Slowly, gradually, over weeks of this relentless dripping pressure, I heard the shift in her voice during their late-night arguments. The weak defensiveness faded, replaced by weary resignation, and then chillingly by a reluctant, then almost eager agreement. She started echoing his arguments, internalizing his justifications, adopting his narrative. "You know, Mom," she said to me one afternoon, cornering me in the hallway, her tone unnaturally bright, overly casual. "Marcus really does have a point about his office situation. That little den is just impossible for his international calls. If he had a bigger, quieter space, like maybe your room, he could probably work from home more often. He'd get to spend more time with me and the kids." She was trying to sell me on the idea, using the grandchildren as emotional leverage, shamelessly framing his blatant selfishness as a potential benefit to the entire family unit. Her own frustrations, likely amplified by Marcus's constant complaints and her own chafing sense of being burdened, began to surface more frequently, directed now at me. She started to see me not as her grieving mother needing support, but as the primary source of friction in her marriage, the inconvenient obstacle preventing her from achieving the perfect, harmonious, high-status life she craved and felt she deserved. My quiet presence, my simple habits that contrasted so sharply with their extravagant ones, my unspoken but likely palpable disapproval of their relentless consumerism, it all began to grate on her nerves, fueled by Marcus's constant whispering in her ear. She became complicit. Actively complicit. She stopped making eye contact with me when Marcus made a particularly cutting remark about my room being wasted space. She started forgetting to save me leftovers from their expensive takeout orders, leaving me to forage for myself in the back of the refrigerator. She began in small, almost imperceptible ways at first, then more overtly to align herself entirely with him against me. They became a united front, presenting a seamless wall of discontent regarding my continued presence. It wasn't just weakness anymore. It wasn't just passive enabling. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate calculation. She was choosing her husband's entitled demands over her mother's basic dignity. She was choosing the glittering, fragile illusion of her new life over the foundational, unwavering bond of family. She was choosing the brand over the blood. And in doing so, she was not just allowing his cruelty, she was becoming an active, willing participant in it. The eventual shout across the dinner table, the ugly final ultimatum, wasn't a sudden, unexpected explosion out of nowhere. It was the inevitable, preordained culmination of a slow, steady, and deeply disappointing surrender to the worst aspects of her own character, amplified and weaponized by the man she had chosen to marry. With Angie now firmly, or perhaps weakly, but effectively neutralized as a potential ally and transformed into a passive if not active co-conspirator, Marcus seemed to feel emboldened, unleashed. The subtle campaign to make me feel uncomfortable, unwelcome escalated into a full-blown psychological siege, a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive tactics clearly designed to make my continued presence in their home not just inconvenient but utterly unbearable. They were trying to smoke me out, to make me so miserable that I would choose exile myself, thereby absolving them of the guilt, or perhaps just the social awkwardness of having to force the issue. My few personal belongings, the small talismans I had brought into the common areas in a futile attempt to carve out a tiny niche of belonging, the framed photograph of George and me on our 25th anniversary that I'd placed on the entryway console table, the small stack of my current library books on the end table in the living room, the hand-knitted Afghan my own mother had made draped over the back of an armchair, began to mysteriously migrate with increasing frequency. I'd find the photograph tucked away on a bottom shelf in the hallway closet, behind a pile of discarded expensive-looking shoes. My books would disappear from the living room, only to reappear days later stacked haphazardly on the floor inside my bedroom, usually placed pointedly right next to the door as if silently screaming, "These do not belong out here." The Afghan vanished entirely for a week, eventually resurfacing, crumpled and smelling faintly of dog in the laundry room hamper. No one ever admitted to moving these things. They just moved. A quiet, constant, infuriating message being sent via inanimate objects. Your things like your presents are clutter. They do not belong here. Stay in your designated zone. The thermostat wars intensified from a chilly skirmish into a full-blown daily battle of wills. I, accustomed to a lifetime of sensible energy use drilled into me by Depression-era parents, and frankly feeling the cold more acutely in my older age, preferred the temperature set around a reasonable, comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Marcus, however, seemed fueled by a perverse need to demonstrate his utter disregard for both utility costs and my comfort. He would stride through the house complaining loudly about feeling like he was suffocating, and crank the air conditioning down to a frigid 65 degrees, turning the house into a veritable icebox. I'd wait until he left for work or went to his office, then quietly nudge it back up a few degrees, seeking a modicum of thermal relief. He'd inevitably notice, grumble about someone messing with the settings again, and crank it right back down, often lower than before, as if to punish my defiance. The house became a landscape of perpetual thermal conflict, with me huddled in multiple sweaters and thick socks inside, while he strode around in shorts and a t-shirt, radiating smug, chilly dominance. Comments about noise became more frequent, more pointed, more clearly aimed at curtailing my simple existence within the house. If I was watching the evening news in the living room at what I considered a perfectly reasonable volume, necessary to hear over the constant hum of their various electronic devices, Marcus would suddenly appear, phone pressed dramatically to his ear, making a great show of needing absolute tomb-like silence for an urgent international conference call, usually placed, I noticed, around the time my favorite news anchor came on. He wouldn't ask me to turn it down. He'd just stand there glaring pointedly at the television screen, radiating impatient disapproval, until I, flustered and apologetic, muted the sound or turned it off completely. Yet his own late-night video game sessions in the family room, complete with simulated explosions, gunfire and shouted commands that echoed through the thin walls and vibrated the floorboards beneath my bed, were apparently exempt from any and all noise considerations. The rules, it seemed, applied only to me. The suggestions that I spend more time out, pursuing activities deemed more suitable for someone of my age and perceived station, became relentless, almost desperate. Angie would leave travel brochures for local senior centers, with bingo schedules and bus trip itineraries circled helpfully, conspicuously on my bed. "Look, Mom, they have bingo on Tuesdays and a sit-and-knit circle on Thursdays. Doesn't that sound like fun? Get you out meeting people." Marcus, meanwhile, would loudly announce his plans to have the guys over for poker on Friday night, adding pointedly, his eyes flicking towards me, "It's probably going to get pretty rowdy, Patty. Lots of testosterone. You might be more comfortable, you know, maybe visiting one of your old friends, or checking out that early bird special at the diner." They were actively, relentlessly trying to create an environment where my very presence felt like an imposition, a violation of their space, their routine, their precious, carefully curated vibe. They didn't need to explicitly tell me I wasn't welcome every single day. They communicated it constantly, through 1,000 small, carefully calibrated acts of exclusion, discomfort and subtle psychological warfare. Even meals, the traditional locus of family connection, became a source of subtle daily humiliation. While I still cooked occasionally, mostly simple solitary meals for myself, as they increasingly favored expensive pre-packaged meal kits or ordering elaborate takeout I wasn't invited to share. If I did happen to join them for dinner, The conversation would inevitably, almost deliberately, veer towards topics designed to highlight my perceived irrelevance and financial inferiority. They'd discuss upcoming trips to exclusive Caribbean resorts I'd only read about in magazines, debate the merits of German versus Italian sports car brands that cost more than my entire retirement fund, or so they thought, or dissect the complex social politics of their elite circle, using names and references I couldn't possibly follow, pausing occasionally to offer me a brief, condescending translation. "He means the chairman of the hospital board, Mom Brenda," Tiffany might explain pityingly. I would sit in silence picking at my food, feeling like an anthropologist observing a strange, alien tribe whose rituals, values, and language were utterly depressingly incomprehensible. It was a deliberate, systematic, and profoundly cruel campaign of othering. They were drawing a clear, sharp, unbreachable line between us, the young, vibrant, successful, important couple, and you, the old, retired, irrelevant, burdensome mother. They were actively trying to make me feel so uncomfortable, so unwelcome, so fundamentally out of place in their shiny, superficial world, that I would eventually, they desperately hoped, choose to leave on my own accord, either retreat permanently to the smaller, less desirable guest room they hadn't yet offered, or better yet, opt for the ultimate solution they kept dangling like a poisoned carrot, the nursing home. It was, I realized, death by 1,000 paper cuts, each tiny incision delivered with a polite smile, a plausible excuse, and the devastating weight of familial obligation. And the truly insidious part, for a while it was working. I felt myself shrinking, retreating further into my room, becoming the quiet, invisible, apologetic burden they clearly wanted me to be. Until, that is, my own quiet, long dormant, ER-tested survival instincts finally blessedly kicked in. Enough was enough. The relentless campaign of passive aggression, the constant chipping away at my sense of belonging and basic human dignity, had an effect, just not the one Angie and Marcus intended. Instead of breaking my spirit, making me retreat further into victimhood, it ignited a long-dormant spark of cold, clear, analytical defiance. It triggered the head nurse in me, the part trained for decades to assess a rapidly deteriorating situation, analyze the underlying symptoms, not just the presenting complaints, formulate a differential diagnosis, and develop a decisive, effective plan of action. I wasn't just going to sit quietly on my uncomfortable daybed and endure their escalating campaign of psychological attrition. I was going to gather intelligence. I was going to verify my assets. I was going to prepare my defenses. And I was going to formulate my own exit strategy. My first step, executed late one night when the house had finally fallen silent, and the faint glow of my laptop screen wouldn't attract unwanted attention, was to confirm, with absolute certainty, the legal reality of the house situation. While I was 99% sure the property was held solely in the name of the P. Williams Family Trust, with me designated as the sole trustee holding all decision-making power, years of dealing with complex hospital bureaucracy and occasional legal challenges had taught me the fundamental importance of verifying documentation. Assumptions, even seemingly certain ones, could be fatal in a high-stakes situation. I navigated the arcane, user-unfriendly pathways of the county recorder's online database, a skill surprisingly similar to deciphering labyrinthine patient charting systems or convoluted insurance pre-authorization portals. I entered the property address, the numbers feeling strangely alien despite representing the very roof currently and precariously over my head. I clicked through the digital records, and there it was, in crisp, unambiguous digital black and white, owner of record P. Williams Family Trust. Trustee Patricia Williams. Date of purchase 2 years prior. LUN status clear. Co-owners none. My ownership wasn't just a memory of a generous act. It was a legally binding, publicly recorded fact. A fact my daughter and son-in-law seemed to have conveniently forgotten, deliberately ignored, or perhaps never truly registered in their self-absorbed worldview. This crucial piece of data confirmed my primary, most powerful point of leverage. I held the deed. They were, legally speaking, merely tenants. My next step was practical, forward-looking. If they were truly planning to escalate their campaign, potentially even trying to force me out through some manufactured crisis. Mom had a fall, she needs professional care, or a bogus legal maneuver. People obsessed with appearances often resort to desperate, underhanded measures when their perfect facade is threatened. I needed to understand my rights as the property owner and their lack of rights as occupants. I spent another long late-night session researching landlord-tenant law in our specific state and county. Specifically, I focused on the process for terminating a tenancy at will, the legal classification for individuals residing in a property without a formal written lease agreement, essentially living there at the owner's discretion. The law, thankfully, was clear and relatively straightforward. It required formal, written notice delivered via certified mail, specifying a date by which the premises must be vacated, typically 30 days depending on the jurisdiction. It outlined the legal recourse available to the owner if the tenants refused to vacate voluntarily. A formal eviction proceeding filed through the courts. The process was bureaucratic, potentially lengthy, but ultimately legally unassailable. I now understood the precise mechanism for reclaiming my property should it become necessary. Forewarned is forearmed. Knowledge, as always, is power. With the legal groundwork understood and my primary asset confirmed, my focus shifted from defense to offense, or rather to strategic preemptive retreat on my own terms. If they were so determined to make my life within these walls untenable, if their ultimate clearly articulated goal was my removal, then staying and fighting a protracted, ugly, emotionally draining war of attrition felt counterproductive, exhausting, undignified. I had spent 40 years fighting battles against death and disease in the ER. My retirement was supposed to be about peace, tranquility, and the quiet enjoyment of my own hard-earned resources. So I started browsing, not the demeaning job listings for retail clerks and cafeteria helpers that they so helpfully kept providing, but real estate listings, not for sterile institutional retirement communities in Florida or Arizona, but for something else entirely, something just for me, my own quiet, long-deferred dream, a small house manageable, comfortable by the sea. For years Frank and I had talked about retiring to the coast, perhaps somewhere along the quiet rocky shores of New England, or the misty coves of the Pacific Northwest. We loved the sound of the waves, the smell of the salt air, the slower, more deliberate pace of life in seaside towns. We'd even started a separate dedicated savings account, labeled simply Sea House Fund, in our meticulous household ledger. After his death I had quietly continued contributing to it, adding a significant portion of the life insurance money, keeping that small flame of a future dream alive. It was my secret hope, my plan B for a future I hadn't quite dared to fully envision yet, a future beyond widowhood, beyond motherhood, a future just for Patty. Now, that future was suddenly urgently calling to me, offering not just solace but escape. I scrolled through hundreds of online listings in charming, quiet coastal towns, a few hours' drive away, places with names like Harbor View, Seabrook, Port Townsend. I wasn't looking for a mansion like Angie and Marcus's monument to insecurity. I was looking for peace, for simplicity, for a connection to the natural world that felt increasingly vital. A small, sturdy cottage, with a porch facing the water, a garden waiting to be tamed, and enough space for my books and my thoughts. A place where I could breathe air that wasn't thick with resentment and unspoken hostility. And then, after hours of searching, I found it, a listing with photos that made my heart give a sudden joyful leap. A charming cedar-shingled cottage weathered by salt and time, perched on a small grassy bluff, overlooking a quiet protected cove. It had a wraparound porch, perfect for watching sunsets over the water. It had a wild, rambling garden filled with overgrown roses and lavender, crying out for attention, and the windows, large and plentiful, seemed to drink in the vast blue, ever-changing expanse of the ocean. It was small, perhaps only 2 bedrooms, easily manageable for one person. It was sturdy, built to withstand coastal storms. It felt right. It felt like home in a way Angie and Marcus's house never could. And crucially, it was listed at a price well within the range I could comfortably easily afford, with a clean, immediate all-cash offer drawn from my Sea House Fund and other liquid assets. The quiet librarian, the underestimated nurse, the grieving widow felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, pure, unadulterated excitement. A plan, a real plan, concrete and actionable, began to form in my mind with startling clarity. Not just a vague plan to escape, but a detailed plan to thrive. A plan to build a new foundation, entirely my own, far away from the wreckage of her children's making. The Sea House wasn't just a distant, wistful dream anymore. It was becoming my imminent reality, my exit strategy, my declaration of independence. Finding the perfect seaside cottage online was the spark. Securing it, quickly, quietly, and decisively, while still living under the increasingly hostile and suspicious gaze of Angie and Marcus, required a different level of strategic maneuvering, the kind of logistical precision I used to employ coordinating multiple trauma teams during a mass casualty event. I couldn't exactly announce I was taking a day trip to the coast to look at real estate and potentially make a life-altering cash purchase. My cover story needed to be plausible, unremarkable, and provide a full day's absence without raising undue suspicion. My years of managing complex hospital schedules, juggling staff vacations, covering unexpected sick calls, and sometimes even fabricating plausible reasons for surgeons' absences from tedious committee meetings, came in surprisingly handy. I needed a bulletproof alibi, preferably one involving an old friend they vaguely knew of but had no independent way to verify. The opportunity presented itself the following Tuesday, disguised as a routine email newsletter from the State Nurses Association. Tucked amidst the announcements for continuing education credits and upcoming conferences was a small notice, a retirement luncheon honoring Dr. Agnes Holloway, the formidable former dean of the University Nursing School, was being held the next day, Wednesday, at a hotel located conveniently about halfway to the coast. Agnes and I weren't close friends, but we were respected colleagues who had served on numerous statewide committees together over the years. Attending her luncheon was a perfectly plausible, even expected activity for a recently retired head nurse like myself. "Angie, dear," I announced casually that Tuesday morning, holding up my phone as if I'd just received the news. "Look at this. Agnes Holloway is retiring. They're having a luncheon for her tomorrow. You remember Dr. Holloway, head of the University Nursing School? She was always so supportive of my work at County General." Angie barely looked up from applying her makeup at the kitchen island. "Oh, yeah, I think I remember the name. Are you going?" Her tone was indifferent, bordering on bored. My professional life held zero interest for her. "I think I should," I said, injecting a note of dutiful obligation into my voice. "It feels like the right thing to do, pay my respects. It's a bit of a drive though, out towards Middletown. I'll probably make a day of it, leave early, maybe stop at that outlet mall on the way back." I added the detail about the outlet mall deliberately, a touch of predictable, slightly déclassé behavior that fit their image of me. Angie shrugged, applying her lip liner with intense concentration. "Okay, Mom, whatever. Have fun." The lack of interest was palpable, almost insulting. My absence, even for a full day, was clearly not just accepted but a welcome relief, freeing her from the burden of my presence. Perfect. The next morning I was out of the house before anyone else was even stirring, my sensible sedan navigating the pre-dawn darkness. I didn't drive towards Middletown and the retirement luncheon. I drove straight west towards the coast, my heart filled with a thrilling mixture of nervous anticipation and exhilarating, almost giddy resolve. This felt like a clandestine mission, a secret operation planned and executed entirely by me, for me. I met the coastal realtor Susan, the cheerful no-nonsense woman from the online listing, at the cedar-shingled cottage at precisely 10:00 a.m. The reality of the place, in the bright morning sunlight, was even better, even more perfect than the pictures had conveyed. The scent of salt and pine needles filled the cool air. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing on the rocks of the cove below was a deep, soothing bass note counterpointed by the high, piercing screech of seagulls wheeling overhead. The house itself felt sturdy, honest, built with integrity. It spoke my language. The view from the wraparound porch wasn't just breathtaking, it felt like a direct connection to something vast, elemental, and deeply peaceful. This was it. This wasn't just a house. It was my future, my sanctuary, my peace. "It's perfect," I told Susan, my voice quiet but firm, filled with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "It's a special spot," she agreed, sensing my conviction. "These bluff cottages don't come on the market often, and when they do, they usually spark a bidding war." "There won't be a war," I said. "I want to make an offer, now, full asking price, cash, contingent on absolutely nothing but a clean title search, and I need to close as quickly as humanly possible. Preferably electronically by tomorrow afternoon. If feasible, I needed speed and discretion." Susan's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with professional focus. Cash offers, especially clean, full-price ones with no contingencies and an accelerated closing, were the holy grail for real estate agents, and for sellers. "Cash? Full price? Quick close?" She grinned, the unmistakable thrill of an easy, significant commission lighting up her face. "Honey, for that kind of offer I can make the sellers personally hand-deliver the keys on a silver platter tied with a gold ribbon by Friday at the latest. Maybe even sooner. Let's go back to my office and write it up immediately." We drove the short distance to her small, cluttered office in the quaint coastal town's main street. While she drew up the electronic offer documents, I used my laptop and a secure mobile Wi-Fi hotspot to contact Arthur Bell, my unflappable financial advisor. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice low and professional, mindful of Susan bustling around nearby. "Initiate wire transfer protocol for Project Sea Breeze. Full amount as discussed. Escrow account details being forwarded to your secure email momentarily." "Consider it done, Brenda," he replied instantly, his voice calm and reassuring. The funds required were substantial, enough to buy the cottage outright with plenty left over for renovations and furnishings, but still merely a fraction of my overall hidden portfolio. The transaction wouldn't even cause a ripple in my larger financial ocean. By lunchtime, the offer was submitted electronically. While Susan anxiously monitored her email for the seller's response, I took a walk down to the town harbor, bought myself a simple delicious crab roll from a dockside stand, and sat on a weathered wooden bench, overlooking the fishing boats bobbing in the water. I felt the sun warm on my face, tasted the salt spray on my lips, and felt a sense of quiet, hopeful anticipation, unlike anything I had experienced in years. At 2:15 p.m., my phone rang. It was Susan, her voice ecstatic. "They accepted. Signed, sealed, delivered. No counteroffer. They're thrilled with the cash and the quick close. We can finalize everything electronically by tomorrow afternoon. The house is yours, Brenda. Congratulations." It was done. Just like that. In the space of a single secret day trip, executed under the cover of a fictitious retirement luncheon, I had secured my escape. I owned a house. My house. A place where no one could tell me what room to sleep in, what temperature to set the thermostat at, or whether my very presence was convenient or burdensome. A place where I was not a guest, not a dependent, not a problem to be managed, but the owner, the matriarch, the queen of my own small seaside castle. I drove back towards the city, towards Angie and Marcus's house, feeling like a spy returning from a successful mission deep behind enemy lines, carrying classified information that would change the course of the war. I made sure to stop and have a pleasant, leisurely 2-hour dinner with my actual retired colleague Brenda Harris, creating the final, verifiable piece of my alibi. When I finally arrived back at the McMansion late that evening, tired but inwardly triumphant, Angie and Marcus barely registered my return beyond a cursory, uninterested inquiry about the luncheon. "How was the party for Dr. Holloway?" Angie asked vaguely, scrolling through her phone while half watching a reality TV show. "Lovely," I replied truthfully, my voice serene, my eyes holding a secret sparkle they completely missed. "Absolutely lovely." I went upstairs to my small room, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a temporary holding cell, the door already unlocked, my release papers signed, sealed, and delivered. I had my safe harbor secured. All I had to do now was wait for them to provide the final, undeniable public justification for my departure, and I had a strong, empirically supported suspicion I wouldn't have to wait very long at all. The breaking point, the final, ugly confrontation that would serve as the catalyst for my departure, arrived as I suspected it would, not with quiet resignation or subtle maneuvering, but with overt, entitled, shouted demands. It happened exactly 1 week after my secret trip to the coast, 1 week after I had become the proud, anonymous, and legally documented owner of my seaside sanctuary. The closing had gone through smoothly, electronically finalized from the privacy of my small room, while Angie and Marcus were out at some pretentious wine-tasting event. The keys were waiting for me, securely held at Susan's real estate office on the coast. My escape plan was fully in place, armed and awaiting activation. All it needed was the final provocation. It was a Tuesday evening, just a regular, unremarkable Tuesday, seemingly like any other in their household. I had made a simple roast chicken for dinner, partly out of habit, partly as a final, almost perverse gesture of domesticity before my departure. A quiet last meal before the execution of my plan. Angie, Marcus, and the children, Maya and Dion, were gathered around the large, ridiculously formal dining table, a space usually reserved for impressing clients or hosting holiday meals, but pressed into service tonight, perhaps because the more casual kitchen island felt too intimate, too close, for the confrontation Marcus was clearly brewing and determined to have. The meal began in a tense, pointed silence that felt fundamentally different from the usual awkward quiet. Marcus wasn't even pretending to be civil tonight. He picked at his food with barely concealed disdain, his jaw tight, his eyes constantly flicking towards the ornate ceiling, towards the room directly above us. My room, the object of his obsessive desire. He radiated impatience, like a predator pacing before a kill. He finally threw his fork down onto his expensive china plate with a clatter that made everyone, including his own children, jump. The sound was sharp, aggressive, a clear signal that the niceties were over. "Angie," he said, his voice low and tight with a carefully controlled frustration that felt far more menacing than shouting. "We need to talk about the office situation. Again. This is becoming untenable." Angie sighed dramatically, pushing her own barely touched food around her plate. She knew exactly what was coming, and she clearly had no intention of stopping it. "Marcus, please, not now," she murmured, a weak, perfunctory protest. "In front of the kids." "Yes, now," he insisted, his voice gaining volume, turning his glare directly towards me, finally dispensing with any pretense of addressing his wife. "Patty, I have been more than patient. I need that room. My business, our family's future, depends on me having a proper professional space to conduct my affairs. I have international clients now, calling at all hours. I need a dedicated, quiet, professional space for my calls. For my virtual meetings. That little den downstairs is a joke. It's practically a closet, and your room," he gestured emphatically towards the ceiling again, his knuckles white, "is the only logical, efficient solution. It's got the best light, the best view, the quietest location in this entire damn house. It's wasted on you." He was laying out his case like a prosecutor delivering his closing argument, framing his blatant entitlement as a matter of urgent professional necessity, a requirement for their very survival. My simple need for a bedroom was positioned as a direct threat to their financial well-being. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, meeting his aggressive gaze calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but firm, holding its ground, "we've discussed this multiple times. This room, the one I currently occupy, suits my needs. It has the attached bathroom, which is important at my age. It's the space Angie specifically offered me when I agreed, at your joint insistence, to sell my home and move in here temporarily." I deliberately emphasized the key terms, offered, agreed, temporarily, reminding him subtly but pointedly of the initial terms of my residence, the promises made, the agreement they now seemed so eager to unilaterally renegotiate. "Needs," Marcus scoffed, a sneering, ugly expression twisting his handsome features. "What possible needs could you have that require the best room in the house? You read books and you sleep. That can be done in a broom closet. I am trying to build an empire here. Doesn't the success of this family, the lifestyle you are currently enjoying, matter to you at all?" "My comfort matters," I replied evenly, refusing to take the bait, refusing to engage with his insulting, reductive caricature of my life. "My dignity matters, and this room provides both. The smaller guest room downstairs, the one next to the laundry, is perfectly adequate for a home office. Many successful people work from much smaller spaces." "Adequate is not good enough," he snapped, his voice rising, the thin veneer of control finally cracking. "I don't do adequate. I need optimal. I deserve optimal, and that room is optimal, and you are standing in the way." Angie jumped in then, not to defend me, not to calm her husband, but to play the role of the frustrated mediator, the long-suffering wife caught between an unreasonable mother and a demanding husband. A role designed to garner sympathy while ultimately siding with him. "Mom, please," she said, her voice taking on that familiar whining, pleading tone that grated on my last nerve. "Just be reasonable. Marcus works so incredibly hard for us, for this family. He deserves a space where he can be productive, where he can focus. Couldn't you just please swap rooms? Just try the smaller room downstairs for a week. It's still nice. It has a window." Her appeal to my reasonableness in the face of his blatant, unreasonable entitlement was the final straw, the spark that ignited the dry tinder of my long-suppressed anger. Reasonable? Was it reasonable to ask a grieving widow, who had already sacrificed her home and contributed significantly to their finances, who technically owned the very ground they stood on, to relinquish the only private, comfortable space she had left, just to accommodate her spoiled son-in-law's desire for a nicer office with a better view? Was it reasonable to expect her to shrink herself yet again to make room for their ever-expanding, never-satisfied sense of entitlement? No. It was not reasonable, it was outrageous. "No, Angela," I said, my voice losing its quiet patience entirely and gaining a hard, clear, unyielding edge that made her flinch. "I will not swap rooms. I will not try the smaller room. This is the room I was given under the terms of my moving in here. This is the room I require for my own comfort and needs. This is the room I will keep. Angie stared at me, genuinely shocked by my direct, unequivocal refusal. She had expected me to fold, as I always had before. Marcus's face flushed a deep, apoplectic red. He slammed his fist hard on the expensive dining table, rattling the plates and making the children jump. Unbelievable, he spat, his voice thick with rage. The sheer unadulterated selfishness. It was then that Angie, seeing her mother finally refuse to bend, seeing her husband's escalating fury threatening to boil over, finally snapped completely. The years of buried resentment towards me, the constant frustration of her own perceived sacrifices, the unrelenting pressure from Marcus, it all erupted in a single ugly, irrevocable moment. The polite mask, the carefully constructed facade of the dutiful daughter shattered completely. She stood up abruptly, shoving her chair back with a loud, violent scrape against the floor. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at me, her face contorted with a rage that was shocking in its intensity, its raw, unfiltered venom. "Look, this is absolutely ridiculous," she shouted, her voice high and shrill, echoing in the suddenly silent room. "We have bent over backwards trying to accommodate you. We took you in, and this is the thanks we get. Constant complaining, constant inconvenience." The revisionist history was breathtaking. "Marcus needs that space," she shrieked, her loyalty now absolute, unquestioning. "He works his ass off so we can live like this, so you can live here for practically free. He deserves that space. This is his house too, you know. He deserves to be comfortable in his own damn home." The irony, the sheer staggering blindness of that statement seemed completely utterly lost on her. "So here's the deal, Mom," she spat, her eyes blazing with a cold hard fury that looked chillingly like her husband's. "No more discussion, no more negotiation. Either you give my husband your room, tonight, right now, or you leave. You pack your bags, and you get out. We are done accommodating you. We are done being burdened by you." The shout, the final, ugly ultimatum hung in the air, raw and irrevocable. The children stared, wide-eyed and silent, forks frozen halfway to their mouths, witnessing the final brutal implosion of their family. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow, deeply unpleasant, utterly triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He had won. He had pushed Angie to the breaking point, and she had delivered the kill shot he desired. They both looked at me then, their expressions a mixture of defiant anger and smug expectation. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected a final, messy, emotional scene, followed by my inevitable defeated surrender. They expected me to crumble under the weight of their combined assault. They didn't know I was already packed. They didn't know the car was on its way. They didn't know the game was already over, and they had spectacularly definitively lost. The silence that followed Angie's explosive ultimatum was thick and heavy, crackling with the toxic static of her rage and Marcus's smug satisfaction. The children, Zoe and Noah, looked back and forth between their furious mother and me, their small faces pale with a mixture of fear and confusion they couldn't possibly comprehend. Marcus leaned back further in his chair, basking in the glow of his perceived victory, waiting, I assumed, for my inevitable capitulation, the tears, the apologies, the meek agreement to move my meager belongings to the smaller, less desirable room. I did not give them the satisfaction. I looked from Angie's flushed, angry face, still trembling slightly with the force of her outburst, to Marcus's self-satisfied smirk. I saw them clearly in that moment, perhaps for the first time since I'd moved in, stripped bare of all pretense, all familial obligation, all remnants of basic human decency. I saw the raw, ugly core of their entitlement, their selfishness, their casual cruelty born not of malice, perhaps, but of a profound, almost pathological self-absorption. And I felt nothing, not anger, not hurt, not even the deep aching sadness that had been my companion for months, just a profound, quiet, and utterly liberating sense of detachment. The final thread, the one that had still, despite everything, tethered me to some lingering residual sense of maternal duty, of familial obligation, had just been decisively, brutally severed, by them, not by me. With a calmness that I could feel unnerving them more than any shouted retort or tearful breakdown would have, I slowly, deliberately, reached for the cheap paper napkin beside my plate. I unfolded it, wiped my lips with a meticulous, almost ceremonial precision, and then folded it neatly again. I placed it gently on the table, next to my uneaten slice of roast chicken, a small, quiet gesture of finality. "All right then," I said, My voice quiet even, betraying no emotion whatsoever. It was the voice I used in the ER when acknowledging a critical diagnosis, accepting the reality and preparing for the necessary action. Angie stared at me, momentarily thrown off balance by my utter lack of the expected emotional reaction. Her fury seemed to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion. All right. What? She stammered, the wind momentarily unexpectedly taken out of her sails. Did she really expect me to negotiate after that, to plead for mercy? All right, I'll leave, I replied simply, stating it not as a concession but as a logical conclusion, a fact established by her own terms. You gave me a choice. Give Marcus the room, or leave. I won't give him the room. Therefore I am leaving. My logic was impeccable, clinical, mirroring the cold rationality they themselves had employed in reaching their decision. I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back quietly, the legs scraping softly on the polished floor. I looked briefly and for the last time with any real connection at my grandchildren. I offered them a small, sad smile, a silent apology for the ugliness they had just witnessed, an ugliness they didn't deserve but were tragically marinating in. Then, without another word, without a backward glance at my daughter or her smug husband, I turned and walked calmly out of the dining room and towards the stairs that led to my room, the room that was as of this moment formerly mine. Angie and Marcus were left stunned, silent in my wake. My utter lack of fight, my immediate quiet, almost serene compliance with their cruel ultimatum was clearly not the reaction they had anticipated, not the scene they had braced themselves for. They had geared up for a battle, for tears, for recriminations, for a messy emotional drama that would ultimately end with their victory. My calm acceptance, my quiet dignity in the face of their ugliness, was deeply, profoundly unsettling. It didn't fit their narrative of the burdensome, dependent, slightly pathetic mother clinging desperately to her comfortable situation. It hinted at a strength, an independence, they hadn't factored into their calculations. They likely exchanged confused, uncertain glances as I disappeared up the stairs. Perhaps a shrug from Marcus, already mentally redecorating his new home gym. Perhaps a flicker of unease, maybe even guilt, in Angie's eyes quickly suppressed. They probably assumed I was going to my room to weep dramatically, to throw things, perhaps to pack a few belongings in a symbolic huff before ultimately choosing the smaller, undesirable guest room, or emerging later defeated and apologetic, ready to beg for forgiveness and accept their terms. They underestimated, as always, my capacity for quiet, decisive and immediate action. They underestimated the depth of my resolve once a decision was finally irrevocably made. They underestimated the power of a woman who had spent 40 years managing crises and had just been handed one she was uniquely and financially equipped to solve. Upstairs, in the room that had been my reluctant sanctuary and prison for the past few months, I felt no sadness, no regret, as I walked directly to the closet and pulled out my old sturdy suitcase already mostly packed from my earlier strategic preparations. There was only a sense of profound, almost cleansing relief. The decision had been made for me, the final ugly words spoken by my own daughter. All that was left was the simple, satisfying logistics of departure. The packing was already done. The car was already ordered. My new life was waiting. Rolling my suitcase down the long, pristine white hallway of their ostentatious house for the final time felt like the closing scene of a play I was profoundly relieved to be exiting. The oversized, meaningless abstract art on the walls seemed to sneer silently, symbols of a world I neither belonged to nor desired, a world whose values felt as hollow as the echoing footsteps behind me. The silence of the house felt heavy, charged now not just with unspoken resentments but with the lingering toxic static of Angie's shout and Marcus's smug triumph. I reached the top of the grand, curving staircase, a feature clearly designed more for dramatic entrances than practical living, and paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation but to steel myself for the final interaction. Looking down into the cavernous, marble-floored foyer, I saw them. Angie and Marcus were standing near the front door, talking in low, tense tones, their body language radiating a mixture of anxiety and impatient expectation. They looked up sharply as they heard the click-clack of my suitcase wheels on the polished hardwood floor of the landing. Their expressions were a fascinating, almost comical study in contrasts. Angie looked pale, worried, perhaps a flicker of guilt or regret warring with the relief of having finally confronted the problem. Marcus, on the other hand, looked impatient, slightly annoyed, as if my departure was taking longer than scheduled. He likely envisioned a quick, tearful retreat to the smaller guest room, not this deliberate, packed suitcase reality. My appearance now, fully packed, handbag firmly on my shoulder, face calm and resolute, was clearly not the denouement they had anticipated. This was not surrender, this was exodus. "Mom?" Angie said again, her voice uncertain, laced with a dawning, unwelcome confusion. The earlier fury had evaporated, replaced by a hesitant apprehension. "What are you doing? Really? Where are you going with that?" "I'm leaving, Angela," I replied simply, starting my slow, deliberate descent down the curving stairs. Each step felt measured, final, echoing slightly in the oversized space. I focused on placing one foot carefully in front of the other, refusing to meet their eyes, refusing to engage with their dawning panic. "You told me to leave if I wouldn't give Marcus my room. I won't give him the room. Therefore, as per your explicit instructions, I am leaving." My logic remained impeccable, clinical, throwing her own harsh words back at her without inflection. But, wait," Angie sputtered, taking a step towards the foot of the staircase, her hands fluttering nervously. "You can't just leave. Like this. Where will you go?" The question wasn't born of genuine maternal concern. I knew instinctively it was born of a sudden terrifying panic about appearances, about logistics, about the inconvenient reality of her elderly mother potentially becoming homeless due to her own actions. How would that play on her carefully curated Instagram feed? Marcus stepped forward then, his expression hardening, his default mode of arrogant, dismissive condescension reasserting itself. Now that the initial shock was wearing off, and his perceived authority was being challenged by my unexpected departure. "Now hold on, just a minute, Patty," he began, his tone attempting to be authoritative, controlling, the voice of the man of the house putting his foot down. "Let's not be overly dramatic here. Nobody is actually kicking you out. We just need to find a practical solution that works for everyone involved." A solution that works for everyone. A transparent euphemism, I knew from long experience, for a solution that works primarily if not exclusively for Marcus. I reached the bottom of the stairs and finally stood before them in the vast, echoing foyer. The ridiculously oversized chandelier glittering coldly above us. I looked from his face, tight with annoyance and thwarted entitlement, to hers, pale with confusion and a dawning desperate fear. They still didn't get it, not really. They still thought they held all the power, all the leverage. They still saw me as the powerless, dependent variable in their domestic equation, someone to be managed, manipulated, and ultimately, accommodated, but only on their terms. "There is nothing left to discuss, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute finality, the tone I used to use when informing a family that resuscitation efforts had failed. "You both made your positions perfectly clear last night. You gave me a choice. I have made it." Just then, punctuating my statement with a timing so perfect it felt almost divinely orchestrated, a sound came from outside, cutting through the tense silence within the foyer. A low, powerful, and distinctly expensive-sounding horn honked once, assertively from beyond the ridiculously oversized faux Baroque wrought iron gates at the end of their long, ostentatious driveway. My ride, my prearranged, precisely timed chariot out of this gilded cage, arriving exactly on schedule. A small, genuine, and deeply satisfying smile touched my lips for the first time since I'd overheard their ugly conversation. It was the smile of a plan coming together perfectly, of a complex procedure executed flawlessly. "That," I announced calmly, "will be for me." I turned my back on their stunned, confused, and suddenly deeply apprehensive faces, and walked towards the grand, imposing front door. I did not need their permission to leave. I did not need their approval for my destination. I did not need anything from them at all. Ever again. The departure was complete. The final act, the revelation, was about to begin. I reached for the heavy, ornate handle of the front door, the cold metal a small, grounding reality in the midst of the swirling emotional chaos. Behind me I could hear Angie and Marcus scrambling, their voices a confused, overlapping babble of panicked questions and sputtering protests, like actors who had suddenly forgotten their lines in the middle of a crucial scene. "Mom, wait! Whose car is that?" Angie cried again, the panic in her voice rising, sharp and thin. "You didn't really call a cab, did you? How could you possibly afford?" Her voice trailed off, the unspoken insulting assumption hanging heavy in the air. "How could you, the poor retiree living on my charity, afford anything beyond a bus ticket?" "Brenda, stop right there!" Marcus commanded again, his voice tight with an anger born less of concern and more of losing control of the situation. "Of me. This is ridiculous. We need to talk about this rationally, like adults." Rationally. As if anything about their behavior over the past month culminating in last night's ugly ultimatum, had been remotely rational or adult. I ignored them. I pulled open the massive heavy door and stepped out onto the wide stone porch, into the cool crisp air of the late evening. The sky was clear, studded with a million distant indifferent stars, mocking the small petty drama unfolding below. It felt like breathing freely for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Down the long, perfectly manicured driveway, beyond the imposing black gates which were now swinging open electronically in silent, obedient welcome, I could see the sleek black silhouette of the Escalade, its powerful headlights cutting twin beams through the suburban darkness. The uniformed driver, Arthur, a man whose quiet professionalism I trusted, stood waiting patiently by the rear passenger door, a silent, reassuring presence. Angie and Marcus followed me out onto the porch, their bare feet silent on the cold stone. They stopped abruptly at the top of the steps, staring down the driveway at the waiting vehicle, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light, a pair of bewildered, suddenly powerless monarchs surveying an unexpected, inexplicable coup unfolding in their own kingdom. Is that a limo service? Marcus scoffed, desperately trying to regain some semblance of his usual arrogant composure, attempting to frame the inexplicable scene in a context he understood, one he could perhaps dismiss as mere ostentation. Really, Patty, isn't that a bit dramatic? Overkill? How are you even paying for that? The implication, still laced with disbelief, was clear. You, the poor retiree living off our generosity, are putting on airs you can't possibly afford. This is just a bluff. A performance. Something like that, I replied vaguely, starting my slow, deliberate walk down the stone pathway towards the waiting car, my old suitcase rolling faithfully, quietly behind me. Each step felt lighter than the last. Each step was taking me further away from their toxic orbit, closer to my own carefully planned, self-funded freedom. They followed me down the path, still sputtering, still demanding answers they weren't entitled to, still operating under the fundamental catastrophic misapprehension of who I was, what I possessed, and what I was capable of. But where will you go? Angie cried again, her voice thin and reedy in the night air. The question now less about concern and more about a dawning, terrifying uncertainty about the consequences of her own actions. You can't just leave like this. You have nowhere to go. You'll end up in a shelter. Mom, please. There was a note of vindictive satisfaction still lingering beneath the panic, perhaps a last, desperate hope that the prospect of homelessness, the confirmation of her worst fears about my pathetic state, would break me, force me back into compliance, back under her control. Mom, be reasonable, Marcus interjected, trying a different tack, the smooth salesman attempting one last desperate pitch to close the deal on his terms. Okay, look, things got heated. We can talk about the room situation, compromise. Maybe the smaller guest room isn't so bad after all. We can fix it up nice for you. Buy you a new TV. Too little, far too late. So much too late. The offer felt cheap, insulting, meaningless. I reached the end of the pathway, the waiting Escalade gleaming under the bright security lights of the gatehouse. Arthur nodded respectfully as I approached, his face impassive. I turned back to face them one last time. They stood there huddled together uncertainly on their perfect chemically green lawn, looking suddenly small, insignificant, almost pathetic under the vast starry canvas of the night sky. Their confusion, their anger, their dawning fear, it was all laid bare on their faces now, their masks of success and control stripped away by the sheer inexplicable wrongness of the scene unfolding before them. Don't worry about me, I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying clearly in the quiet night, each word carefully chosen, precisely aimed. I assure you I won't be ending up in a shelter. I looked directly at Angie, at my daughter, the child whose betrayal, whose casual cruelty born of weakness, cut the deepest. And I won't be needing the smaller guest room either, dear. I gestured towards the waiting vehicle, towards the quiet, luxurious symbol of the life they couldn't comprehend, the life I had earned and kept hidden. My driver, I explained, letting the words land with quiet, devastating precision, stripping away their last shreds of denial, is taking me home. Home? Angie whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief, her voice trembling. What home? You sold your home. My new home, I clarified gently, allowing myself a small, deeply satisfying smile, as the final pieces of their shattered reality fell irrevocably into place around them, burying them under the rubble of their own miscalculations. The one I purchased earlier this week. A charming little place, quite peaceful. I paused, delivering the final, crushing detail. By the sea. The following morning dawned bright and clear, both literally over the sparkling turquoise water visible from my new bedroom window and metaphorically in the quiet, uncluttered landscape of my newly liberated mind. I woke early, not to the cramped discomfort of the daybed in their sterile guest room or the oppressive, resentful atmosphere of Angie and Marcus's house, but to the gentle, rhythmic sound of waves washing ashore just yards away and the cheerful, raucous cry of seagulls overhead. I made myself a cup of strong, hot coffee in my brand new state-of-the-art kitchen, chosen carefully and paid for entirely by me, and took it out onto the wide wraparound porch of my seaside cottage. The air was cool, clean, and carried the sharp, invigorating tang of salt and damp sand. This wasn't a temporary arrangement, dependent on the whims and moods of others. This was home, mine, earned. Meanwhile, back in the sprawling, soulless McMansion they mistakenly believed was the symbol of their success, but which I knew was merely a heavily mortgaged asset legally owned by my trust. Angie and Marcus were likely waking up to a very different, far less tranquil reality. Perhaps they had spent a fitful night arguing, pointing fingers, desperately trying to spin a narrative that absolved them of blame for the previous evening's disastrous, inexplicable turn of events. Perhaps in the harsh light of morning they had managed to convince themselves it was all just a bluff, a bizarre, overly dramatic gesture from an old woman seeking attention, fueled by senility or spite. Perhaps they clung to the hope that I would inevitably come crawling back, tail between my legs, full of apologies and ready to accept their terms, having discovered the harsh realities of trying to survive on my own. Perhaps they had even, in a final act of arrogant denial, begun moving Marcus's expensive exercise equipment and oversized desk into my recently vacated room, eager to claim their spoils and erase the last physical traces of my inconvenient presence. Their carefully constructed illusions, however, were about to collide head-on with the cold, hard, unyielding reality of legal documentation. At precisely 10:30 a.m., just as I was settling into a comfortable wicker chair on my porch with a good book, I knew a certified process server dispatched promptly that morning by Mr. Abernathy's high-powered law firm as per my instructions, would be arriving at their oversized, pretentious front door. I pictured the scene with a grim, righteous satisfaction. Angie, perhaps still clad in her expensive silk pajamas and eye mask, expecting a delivery from her favorite online boutique, opening the door instead to a stern-faced man holding a crisp, official-looking envelope. "Angela Williams Carter?" the server would ask neutrally, confirming the identity of the recipient. "Yes?" she'd reply, perhaps with a hint of impatience. "You've been served." The classic chilling phrase, delivered with professional detachment. Inside the envelope, nestled amongst the formal legal boilerplate, would be a single terrifyingly clear document. It wouldn't be a lawsuit, not yet, that required further deliberation depending on their reaction. It would be something far more fundamental, far more immediately devastating to their sense of security. Official notice to vacate. The document would state, in clear, unambiguous, and legally binding language, that the property located at their full address, currently occupied by Angela Williams Carter and Marcus Carter, was legally owned solely and entirely by the P. Williams Family Trust. It would further state, with cold precision, that the sole trustee of said trust, Miss Patricia Patty Williams, was hereby exercising her legal right to terminate their informal, verbal tenancy at will agreement, effective immediately upon receipt of this notice. Pursuant to the applicable state and local housing laws, which Mr. Abernathy had meticulously researched, they were legally required to vacate the premises entirely, removing all personal belongings, and leaving the property in a clean, undamaged condition, within 30 calendar days from the date of service. Failure to comply fully and peacefully by the specified date would result in formal eviction proceedings being initiated through the appropriate court system, seeking not only possession of the property but also significant damages, legal fees, and potentially impacting their credit scores for years to come. The document would be signed by me, my signature obtained electronically the day before, dated and notarized, bearing the official intimidating stamp of Abernathy Klein & Associates, a firm known for its ruthless efficiency in property litigation. It was not a request, it was not an opening bid in a negotiation, it was a legally binding order, backed by the full weight of the law and the undeniable fact of my ownership. An eviction notice, served to them in the very house they had tried to make me feel unwelcome in, the very house they had used as a weapon, a bargaining chip, in their cruel ultimatum. The irony was exquisite. The justice, while harsh, felt perfectly, poetically sublime. They had told me in no uncertain terms to leave their house, and now, the house itself, through the quiet, impersonal but utterly unyielding mechanism of the legal system I had put in place years ago as a simple measure of asset protection and they had foolishly, arrogantly ignored or forgotten, was telling them the exact same thing. Their entire sense of ownership, their entire foundation of entitled, complacent residency was built on sand, specifically on my sand, the ownership of which I was now formally, legally and irrevocably withdrawing. The game had changed. The locks might still be theirs for the moment, but the deed was mine, and the clock was ticking. The arrival of the notice to vacate, that crisp white envelope delivered by a stranger, would have initially been met not with immediate comprehension, but with stunned, sputtering disbelief. Angie and Marcus, their minds still reeling from the shock of my dramatic departure and the baffling, inexplicable revelation of my car service and claimed new home, would likely stare at the formal legal document. Eviction? Tenancy agreement? P. Williams Family Trust? Trustee Patricia Williams, as if it were written in ancient hieroglyphics. It simply wouldn't compute within the framework of their established reality. Their first reaction, predictable for people whose sense of self is built on a foundation of entitlement and the assumption of their own importance, would be denial, followed swiftly and inevitably by indignant outrage. This had to be a mistake. A cruel, elaborate joke, another one of Patty's manipulative, vindictive games. Payback for the ultimatum. How dare she? After everything they had so generously done for her, the narrative of their own victimhood would likely coalesce instantly, blinding them to the possibility of their own culpability. I could picture the frantic, furious phone calls that would surely follow. First likely to me, calls that would slam directly into the dead end of my old, now disconnected voicemail, fueling their frustration and sense of persecution. Then, they would call me Patty and hit the disconnected number. Frustration mounting. Then, the frantic scrambling, the desperate search for external validation of their outrage would begin. Marcus, the slick salesman accustomed to bullying his way to a desired outcome, would probably call his own lawyer immediately. Sputtering about harassment, about tenants' rights, completely misapplying the concept, about the sheer injustice and illegality of it all. He'd demand the lawyer do something, issue a countersuit, teach that ungrateful old woman a lesson. Angie, meanwhile, might tearfully call her circle of equally superficial friends, weaving a dramatic, self-pitying narrative of her poor, potentially senile and clearly vindictive mother, suddenly going rogue, possibly manipulated by some unseen force, perhaps the mysterious driver of the Escalade, turning against her own loving daughter for no discernible reason. But somewhere amidst the storm of denial, the furious blame-shifting and the frantic spinning of narratives, the cold, hard seed of fear planted the night before, the fear ignited by the Escalade, the mention of the Sea House, the cash purchase, would begin to sprout, choking out the weeds of their outrage. The house, the trust. Patty bought it. Could she really own it? The unthinkable, impossible possibility would start to take root in the fertile ground of their dawning panic. They would scramble then, with a desperation born of true terror, through their own disorganized files, searching for the closing documents from 2 years prior, documents they likely never read closely, blinded as they were by the excitement of moving into their enormous status-affirming dream home, at what seemed like an unbelievably favorable arrangement. They'd find the deed, buried under a pile of car lease agreements and credit card statements, and there it would be, in stark, irrefutable, legally binding black and white, likely highlighted now by the cold dread filtering through their minds. Grantor, previous owner's name, grantee, P. Williams Family Trust, trustee signature Patricia Williams. Or perhaps in their mounting panic, unable to locate the physical documents amidst the chaos of their lives, they would call the county recorder's office directly demanding information, their voices tight with anxiety, and a bored, indifferent clerk, after a brief search of the public records database, would confirm the official, unassailable truth. The house they lived in, the house they showed off to their friends and colleagues, the house they possibly used as collateral for loans or lines of credit to fund their extravagant lifestyle, the house where Marcus was already mentally installing his infrared sauna in my former room, wasn't legally theirs. It never had been. It belonged solely and entirely to the quiet, unassuming retired nurse they had treated with such contempt, the woman they had just effectively kicked out onto the street. The full, devastating, world-altering truth would hit them then with the force of a physical blow, knocking the very air from their lungs. Their entire lifestyle, their carefully constructed image of effortless success, their very sense of identity, was built not just on sand, but on a foundation legally owned by someone else. A foundation they had just insulted, abused, threatened, and ultimately evicted. Their incredibly favorable rent-free or heavily subsidized living arrangement, the invisible financial bedrock that allowed for their constant stream of designer purchases, luxury car leases and curated online pronouncements, was gone. Terminated, with 30 legally mandated days' notice. Panic, raw and unfiltered and terrifying, would set in then. Where would they possibly go? They lived in one of the most expensive, competitive suburban housing markets in the state. Market rent for a house even half the size of the one they currently occupied would be astronomical, far beyond their actual non-subsidized means. Especially now that my monthly contribution was also gone. Could they even qualify for a new mortgage on their own, given their likely substantial debt-to-income ratio, inflated by years of living beyond their true means? The house wasn't just a place to live. It was the essential cornerstone of their entire identity, their social standing, their precarious financial solvency, and they had just, through their own breathtaking arrogance, their own casual cruelty, their own epic failure of basic human decency, sawed off the very branch they were sitting on, high above the unforgiving ground. The smug satisfaction they had felt just hours before, the relief of having finally gotten rid of the inconvenient judgmental mother-in-law, would curdle instantly into the cold, sickening terror of impending homelessness, financial ruin and utter social disgrace. The eviction notice wasn't just a piece of legal paper, it was a brutally accurate mirror reflecting back at them the true, precarious, fragile and deeply unattractive reality of the lives they had built on borrowed ground. The final act of this domestic drama unfolds not on a single stage, but on two starkly contrasting ones, playing out simultaneously but separated by miles of highway and entire universes of emotional reality. Scene 1. The gated community McMansion. Inside the house I own, chaos reigns. Panic metastasizes into frantic, ineffective action. Recrimination fills the air like toxic smoke from a house fire. I picture Angie and Marcus surrounded by half-packed moving boxes, their minimalist palace now cluttered, disorganized, reflecting their internal turmoil. Their arguments, I imagine, are no longer whispered conspiracies, but loud, bitter, ugly shouting matches echoing through the large, empty-feeling rooms that no longer feel like home, but like a rapidly shrinking prison cell with a 30-day lease. Angie, weeping hysterically, blames Marcus for his relentless pressure, for his arrogance, for pushing too hard, for ruining everything. Marcus, his face a mask of cold reptilian fury, blames Angie for her trashy, incompetent mother, for her own inherent weakness in not handling the situation sooner, more decisively, perhaps even for deceiving him about the true ownership structure. They frantically scour online real estate listings for rentals they might possibly afford in less desirable neighborhoods, their faces paling, then turning ashen at the astronomical prices, the grim reality of their actual financial standing, hitting them like a physical blow. They make desperate, increasingly humiliating calls to friends, relatives, even business acquaintances, seeking temporary lodging, spinning some frantic face-saving story about sudden, unexpected renovations or a burst pipe. But they are met, I imagine, with polite, cool evasions, awkward silences, suddenly unreturned calls, news of scandal, especially involving family betrayal, money, potential elder abuse and public humiliation, details undoubtedly leaked by neighbors who witnessed my departure, embellished by gossips or perhaps even subtly seeded by my own discreet PR team, travels with lightning speed in their tightly knit world of performative perfection. Their social currency has plummeted overnight. Their carefully cultivated brand is now irrevocably toxic. Their perfect life is imploding, collapsing under the weight of its own fragile, debt-ridden, morally bankrupt foundation. They are facing not just the imminent, humiliating loss of their home, my home, but the catastrophic, public loss of their carefully crafted image, their precarious social standing, their entire sense of self-worth, which was so deeply, so fatally intertwined with the illusion of effortless wealth and domestic bliss. They are adrift in a churning, unforgiving sea of consequences, frantically treading water, with no land, no rescuer, no lifeboat in sight. The 30-day clock on the notice to vacate ticks down like a merciless time bomb strapped beneath their feet. Scene 2. The seaside cottage. Outside my new home, peace descends with the setting sun. Tranquility reigns. Order is gently, purposefully being restored. I, Patty Williams, sit serenely on my screened-in porch, overlooking the calm blue-gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean as dusk settles. The air is filled with the rhythmic, soothing susurrus of waves washing ashore on the small, private beach just below the bluff, and the distant, lonely cry of seagulls making their final flights of the day. The house behind me, smaller but infinitely warmer, more authentic than the one I left, is filled with the comforting, familiar presence of my own cherished belongings. Arranged exactly as I like them, each object telling a story, holding a memory that brings me solace, not pain. The garden, though still needing considerable work after years of neglect by the previous owners, shows the first promising signs of my dedicated care. Weeds meticulously cleared from the rose beds, soil turned and enriched in the vegetable patch, new lavender and rosemary seedlings carefully planted near the porch, waiting patiently for spring to release their fragrance. I am sipping a cup of hot chamomile tea, a well-loved novel by Toni Morrison open but unread, on my lap. My face, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp, is serene, relaxed, etched not with bitterness or the lines of recent trauma, but with a quiet, profound, almost luminous sense of contentment, of belonging, of being exactly where I am supposed to be. I have weathered the storm. I have navigated the personal and logistical crisis with the quiet competence and steely resolve that defined my 40-year career, and I have emerged, not just intact, but stronger, freer, more fully, unapologetically myself than I have felt in years. I am finally, truly, blessedly home. My phone resting on the small wicker table beside my comfortable armchair, my new phone with its new private, unlisted number, buzzes softly. It's not Angie or Marcus, their old numbers, along with anyone remotely associated with them, have been preemptively permanently blocked, consigned to the digital void, their access to me revoked, as surely as their access to my house soon will be. It's a brief, encrypted email notification delivered via secure app from Mr. Abernathy, my meticulous, highly effective and reassuringly expensive lawyer. Subject: Property Update. Carter Tenancy Eviction Process. Message: Occupants received notice to vacate via certified process server yesterday AM 10:30, as confirmed by server affidavit. Initial response from occupants, relayed through their likely overwhelmed legal counsel, reported as agitated and exploring options. Standard delaying tactics anticipated. Formal eviction proceedings initiated today concurrently through Superior Court, as per your standing instruction, to minimize any potential procedural delays. Process expected to take approximately 4 to 6 weeks per current state statute timelines, barring unforeseen complications. No further action required on your part at this time. We'll keep you apprised of all developments. Suggest you continue to enjoy the excellent seaside view and perhaps consider taking up watercolor painting. I read the message, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. Justice, like the wheels of hospital bureaucracy I knew so well, sometimes moves slowly, grindingly, requiring patience and meticulous documentation, but it moves surely, inexorably, inevitably. I close the email app. I take another slow, mindful sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, the quiet, the sheer, unadulterated peace of the moment. I look out at the endless, calming horizon, where the darkening deep blue of the ocean meets the pale, infinite, star-dusted expanse of the evening sky. I don't feel triumph, not in the petty, gloating way Marcus might understand it. I don't feel a surge of vengeful glee, though perhaps a quiet, grim satisfaction. Mostly I feel peace, the deep, quiet, unshakable peace of a life lived with integrity, a conscience clear despite the necessary painful actions taken to protect myself, and a future stretching before me entirely, blessedly my own. They had tried to confine me, to diminish me, to define me by their narrow materialistic standards, to ultimately erase me from their perfect picture, but I had simply refused their definition. I had rewritten the script. I had chosen my own path, built my own foundation, both literally and figuratively, and found my own sanctuary, far from their toxic reach, funded by my own labor. Let them rage against the consequences they had so carelessly, so cruelly created for themselves in their echo chamber of entitlement and disrespect. I had the sea, my books, my nascent garden waiting for spring, and the quiet, unassailable strength of knowing, deep in my bones, that I had finally definitively done the right thing for myself. Justice served, not with a shout across a dinner table, but with the quiet, inexorable, cleansing rhythm of the tide washing away the debris left on the shore. Thank you for watching.